In Chapter 10, the title given is Devotion by Means of the Universal Divine Perfections. The words universal divine perfections have a significance not usually perceived. Men speak of perfection from the standpoint of imperfection, and always in relation to forms, conditions, and appearances that are constantly changing, so that with humanity in general, the standard of perfection is an ever-receding and elusive as well as delusive idea. Here again, as with our modern science, we reason from particulars to universals instead of from universals to particulars, instead of from universals to particulars, never perceiving that nothing less is the cause itself, could ever know itself. The discourses of Krishna but repeat that which was known before to the perfected men of all ages, and that which all divine incarnations have since declared, that man is identical with the Absolute Unmanifested, and also with the Deity as we see it, manifested in nature. Our doctrines and education lead us to think that we are inherently imperfect. If we are so, we can never by any possibility become perfect. But if we are inherently perfect, we can see, understand, and correct imperfect knowledge and use of all forces. For it is forces we are dealing with, not forms. It is ideas, not persons. We will begin to understand that there is but one force or power, the spiritual, and that all the various effects of that one power or force that we see and experience are due to the direction given by conscious entities of many kinds in their different degrees. To understand the divine perfections, they must be applied universally, from the standpoint of the one self, the self of each, the self of all. While the Gita is laid out in the form of a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna as between a divine teacher and his disciple, and may be so understood, it can also be applied in another way. Krishna is the higher self in each, and Arjuna the mind, the mirror of external impressions, so that dialogue can be profitably taken as a means to the realization of the self and its adjustment and control of the lower elements and forces. The keynote of the ancient teaching is that the creative and sustaining power of all things and beings is not to be sought for externally. It can only be found at the very root of the nature of each and every being. As it is put in the Upanishads, the self-being pierced the opening outward, hence one looks outward, not within himself. The wise who seek the eternal look inward, for that which lives and thinks in man is the eternal pilgrim, as stated in the Secret Doctrine. It is necessary then for the student to dwell upon the idea that he acts for and as the self of all, that the power to see all and to know all is potentially present with him, is in fact his real self. He will at least then understand when Krishna says, "Neither the assemblage of the gods nor the adept kings know my origin, because I am the origin of all the gods and of the adepts. I am the origin of all things proceed from me," that he is speaking of the self and all and of each, and that the origin of that which is eternal and unchanging is not to be discovered, for it is both being and non-being. As Patanjali states it, the soul is the perceiver, is vision itself, pure and simple, and it looks directly on ideas. This means that each human being has the power to see and know all things, however restricted that power may be at any given time, that the restriction lies in the more or less narrow range of the ideas that he adheres to, and which form the basis for his actions. This self-limited range of perception not only prevents the full existence of his powers as self, but acts as a bar to the right understanding of his observation and experience. So even the man of today may say, "I am the origin of all things proceed from me," for so far as he is concerned, his adopted ideas and acquired nature form the basis for all causes set in motion by him, and also constitute his field of observation and experience of effects. By the very power that resides in self, man creates good and evil, the delusion of a separateness and all imperfections. Divine perfections are universal. They can only be reached by acting for and as the self in all things. This state can be obtained by a gradual elimination of all bases of action that make for separateness. Arjuna begins by stating to himself, Krishna, the characteristics that to him designate the very highest place and power. Thou art Parabrahm, beyond Brahma. Thou art eternal presence, the divine being, all-pervading, without beginning. Thou alone knowest thyself by thyself. Thou alone can fully declare thy divine powers. How shall I, constantly thinking of thee, be able to know thee? In what particular forms shall I meditate on thee? The reply begins with, I will make thee acquainted with the chief of my divine manifestations, for the extent of my nature is infinite. I am the ego which is seated in the hearts of all beings. I am the beginning and the end of all existing things. He then goes on to recite that among the gods the self is the highest. Among planetary bodies the sun expresses it. Among the spirits of the air the chief of these is an expression of it. Among the sacred writings it is the essence of these, the all-compelling song or sound, and so on through a long list of forms, powers and qualities understood by Arjuna. He concludes by saying, I am, O Arjuna, the seed of all existing things, and there is not anything, whether animate or inanimate, which is without me. My divine manifestations are without end. The many which I have mentioned are by way of example. Whatever creature is permanent, of good fortune or mighty, also know it is to be sprung from a portion of my energy. But what, O Arjuna, hast thou to do with so much knowledge as this? I established this whole universe with a portion of myself and remain separate. Arjuna had asked Krishna under what particular form should the self be worshipped. Krishna's reply was, under all forms, that there is nothing in the universe, animate or inanimate, which is without the self. The seeker for truth and knowledge must see the one self in all things, and all things in the self, and then act for and as the self of all. All sacred writings are addressed to the individual, for it is from within the individual and the individual alone that reformation can begin and must be consummated. The study and application of the Gita tends to break down all ideas based upon separateness, and impresses upon the student that the way of true knowledge of the divine perfections lies in the universal service, without distinction of caste, creed, sex, color, or race. Self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child.